Well, I'm very happy to be here and to have a chance to talk to all of you, especially for this opportunity to visit the center at the beginning of this very important project on excellence in economic statistics. I think this is a very important, almost historic event in the national accounts and in economic measurement in the UK. So let me just see if I can find this. Yeah. So I'm going to talk about progress in economic measurement, and I'm going to divide that into two parts. I'm going to talk about what's actually been done, which actually been incorporated in the national accounts, and I'm going to use the U.S. as an example, but it turns out there are many other countries, including the UK, that have incorporated all or part of this. But it's very important to think about production as what has been done. There is, at every point in a discussion of the national accounts, some equivalent of the idea that GDP is not a measure of welfare. And so the other part of my discussion will be about welfare and how that could be measured in the GDP. But I want to emphasize that the measurement of welfare is a topic for the future and not an accomplishment of the past. Nonetheless, there's been a lot of progress in the research literature about measurement of welfare, and I'm going to draw on some very important research done here in the UK, home product, so to speak, that informs a lot of the important research that has been done. However, the transformation of that into a practical measurement program is something that is still ahead of us. So this is a talk about the progress in economic measurement. However, it's both about the accomplishment of the measurement of production and its use in economic analysis, and the future measurement of welfare, which is yet to be accomplished, but where we've made a lot of progress in terms of the research frontier. So my discussion will then be divided into these two parts. First of all, I suppose the question is, how do you know there's been so much progress in economic measurement? Well, here's a list, and there'll be a quiz at the end of our discussion here, so we'll see how much of this you can reproduce at that point. First and foremost, I'm going to talk about the incorporation of inputs and productivity into the national accounts, which has made it possible to standardize the notion of productivity, which until fairly recently was ill-defined, something that anybody could choose a definition for. But now we have an official system of productivity, and I'm going to discuss that in this lecture. Secondly, there is the integration of the flow of funds and the national income and product accounts. The flow of funds have to do with the links to capital and finance, and the national accounts has to do with mainly output and input and its distribution between government and private expenditure. And these two have been pretty thoroughly linked. That's among the accomplishments, things that have actually been achieved. So that's a very important advance, and it's fairly recent. Then there's the question of the incorporation of welfare into the national accounts, and as I say, that's something in which there's an incomplete process, first at the research level, but now with the prospect of incorporating this into the national accounts on the basis of some kind of standardized process that will make this part of regular reporting. The incorporation of industry-level detail on productivity is something which is a past accomplishment. Rachel referred to that. The official system in the United States is something that has been extended backward all the way back to 1947. It covers more or less the whole history of the national accounts, and that is an accomplishment that has already been completed. Number 5. Turns out that the incorporation of intellectual property into the national accounts is something that has been achieved. That was agreed upon by the international community, and so research and development, artistic originals, other forms of intellectual property are now part of the national accounts. They are assets, they have services, they are things in which you can invest and measure through market processes. Then, now we get into international comparisons. One of the most important achievements of recent times is to develop a systematic comparison basis for accounts from different countries. So we now have internationally comparable accounts. How did this happen? Well, we began to develop something called purchasing power parities. In other words, prices that compared the same commodity or the same service in different countries. And those now cover, hold your breath, 199 countries. This is a product of the World Bank. It was published in 2014, very recent accomplishment, and that is now part of the official system. Furthermore, this has been extended to international comparisons of productivity. Is the UK, for example, more or less productive than France? Or is Germany more or less productive than the US? Is Japan as productive as these European countries? Well, that's something in which there's an answer in the research literature. This is not part of some official national accounts, but the program for the future is going to shift away from the national accounts to a new system which is going to cover the whole world. In other words, the people who have designed systems for national accounts have now become much more ambitious, and what they've decided to do is to have a world system of accounts, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the accomplishments today. Then there is using the purchasing power parities for measuring productivity and using that as a basis for international comparisons. The part of the world system that has already been put together is called the World Input-Output Database. This includes internationally comparable figures for outputs and for inputs at the industry level, covering 40 countries. So that's in process. And then finally, there is the incorporation of distributional information into the national accounts, microdata at the household level, which is part of the program for creating a measure of welfare. And then, to cap it all off, the World Bank is about to release something that is, I think, of momentous importance, and that is measures of sustainability which incorporate an idea of investment in human capital that goes far beyond the national accounts. Well, that is our agenda. I'm not going to get through all the details, obviously, but I do want to give you an outline of what is in prospect when you begin to discuss progress in the national accounts. Okay, let's proceed then, and let's go back. Get this right. Okay.
That's a conclusion.
Am I going in the wrong direction?
Okay, somebody better help him.
Okay. Here we are. So now we're at the first slide again. And here's what I just said, that we're going to talk about production and welfare. And we're going to do that within a system of national accounts. And GDP is going to appear as a production measure. And there's going to be a future concept called the standard of living, which is going to be a measure of welfare. That's not part of the official system. The GDP is part of the official system. Then, when we talk about sustainability, I want to talk about expanding the national accounts, because we need to go beyond the market. And that's something that Rachel has already used as a very interesting example. So I think that that's our program. And so let's proceed. First of all, in order to understand the distinction between what's been done and what hasn't been done, we need to understand the institutional framework. So here is a thumbnail sketch. The organization that rules this particular part of our intellectual universe is called the United Nations Statistical Division. As you can tell from the name, it's part of the UN. And it has a governing body which consists of 25 national statisticians from national statistical agencies like the Office of National Statistics or like the Bureau of Economic Analysis in the United States. These are the people who decide what's in the national accounts. And the system of national accounts, the so-called SNA, for 2008 is the latest version, is the product of a consensus arrived at by the UN Statistical Division, by consultation of international agencies like the OECD and Eurostat and the World Bank and the IMF, but also national statistical agencies around the world. That arrives every 15 years or so at a new system of national accounts. And so that defines what the GDP is, it defines what appropriate measures of welfare are, if there are any, and then it's within that system of national accounts that we can define what is within the GDP, in other words, in the national accounts according to the consensus description, and beyond the GDP. Well, let me stop at this point and see if anybody has any questions or clarifying comments that they would like to offer. Well, all right. So this is the institutional framework, and now let's proceed. Here is the document. We could argue all day about particular points, but if we wanted to find a definitive treatment of what is in and what is not in the national accounts, this is the system of national accounts, most recently revised in 2008. You can see there the United Nations, the statistical division, which actually is the convening body. But the other sponsors here include the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the OECD, and Eurostat, and all of these contribute to this process of consensus building. This changes from time to time. For example, I talked to you about intellectual property. Intellectual property was not included in the national accounts until 2008. That's a fairly recent development. So now we find in the national accounts implemented around the world, because almost every country has already adopted this, a measure of intellectual property, first of all as investment, as an output of an industry, and also as part of the capital of the national accounts, since the system of national accounts describes capital as well. Well, I'm going to use this as a point of reference then for determining what is in the national accounts, what is in the GDP, and what would be appropriate as a measure of welfare. Well, let's focus on, first of all, production, because that's what we've already accomplished, and actually we've accomplished quite a bit. So I'm going to refer to a new architecture for the U.S. national accounts, which was published in 2006. This is a book that I edited for something called the Conference on Research and Income and Wealth, a group mainly based in the United States. And so that new architecture proposed some innovations. What it said is that we can measure output as a GDP, and there's a corresponding measure of input. And the ratio of the two is productivity. Well, there's nothing new about that at this point. But in 2006, when this book was published, it turns out that the official ruling definition of the national accounts said that measuring productivity was impossible. What? Well, it was impossible because it was impossible to measure capital. There are people other than me, not many of us in this audience, who are old enough to remember why. There was the great so-called Cambridge controversy about capital, in which the UK participants took the position that measuring capital was impossible, and the US participants said, no, you could measure capital. And the UK won. It turned out that there was no way to measure capital, therefore no way to measure input, and therefore no way to measure productivity in the national accounts. All of that changed in 2007. And how did that happen? It happened as a result of a meeting of the UN Statistical Division, at which it was agreed that the rules had changed and that capital could be measured by capital services, labor by labor services, productivity by the ratio of output to input. And so that was incorporated into the 2008 system of national accounts. The rules changed. And of course, that's a result of this consensus. So measuring capital and labor services became possible, and it became possible to do international comparisons. But that wasn't true until 2007. Well, that's going to have a very important moral for our story about measuring welfare. Because if you look carefully at the system of national accounts for 2008, which I just
displayed, you will find that it says just as explicitly that it's impossible to measure welfare, just the way it used to be impossible to measure productivity. Well, there's a possibility of changing the rules, and that's what I'd like to consider in order to incorporate welfare into the national accounts, but that's a subject that I'll now develop a little bit more detail. I do want to make one point, though, and that is that as far as measuring output and input and productivity, it's possible now to use the same basic ideas for international comparisons. International comparisons by using purchasing power parities. How do I do that? I use purchasing power parities for the outputs and the inputs, and then my productivity growth for, say, UK can be compared with the productivity growth for the US or for Germany or any other country for which there are purchasing power parities, of which there are 199 countries. Well, here is our blueprint then for the national accounts. At the top is the production account, and there's gross domestic product and gross domestic factor outlay. And so in nominal terms, those are the two parts of the production account. They are equal by definition to each other in nominal terms. But if we deflate each one of those by a corresponding deflator of input or output, then we get something in real terms. And by fixing the base year for the index number system, we can measure growth rates, and they can differ. And that will give us a different growth rate for the difference between the two, which we'll call the growth rate of productivity. All right, well that's then the way in which we look at the production problem. We look at it in terms of incorporating a deflator for the input. So going back to what I said before, it was impossible until 2008 to define an appropriate deflator for the input side and therefore productivity. That's what it meant to say that it was impossible to do the measurement of the input side. And the reason for that is that we couldn't measure capital. But now, after 2008, that's changed, and we now have measures of input, output, and productivity at the aggregate level and at the industry level, as Rachel told you. Now, the next innovation is that the production account, including the GDP, is integrated with this set of capital accounts. First of all, the expenditure of both domestic income and net foreign income. And then secondly, the contribution to the increment in capital, the domestic capital account, and finally, the domestic balance sheet. And we can do the same thing for national expenditure, national foreign transactions on capital account, and for the U.S. international position. So all of those things now can be treated as part of the national accounts. They are fully integrated with the GDP and with production. So that's a very recent advance. Well, all right, so that's the basis for our discussion of the progress in measuring production and productivity, which, as I say, is a fairly recent undertaking. Now, as I said, we can take this system and use this for international comparisons. So the basic idea is that we have purchasing power parities between, say, the US and Japan, and that enables us to measure Japanese GDP and US GDP and see which one is larger, which one is growing more rapidly, etc. These are the purchasing power parities that I'm referring to. These are fairly recent, and the dark line, the black line there, is the measure of output, and that begins with the Japanese output being about 20% of 200, yen, and then its price gradually rising to something like 300 yen, and then declining, as you can see, to less than 100 yen per dollar. Okay, well that's our purchasing power parity for output, the black line, and it's very interesting to compare this with the exchange rates. So way back in 1955, the exchange rate of the yen for the dollar was 360 yen per dollar. The purchasing power parity was more like 220. And so at that time, the Japanese yen was incredibly undervalued and gave Japan an enormous competitive advantage, not a comparative advantage, but a competitive advantage. And that continued all the way through to the 70s, where the purchasing power parity finally began to be above the purple
perimeter there, which describes the exchange rate. Then, beginning around 1985, the yen became very expensive, and since that time, the Japanese currency, instead of being undervalued, has been overvalued, giving Japan a tremendous comparative disadvantage. Well, it's this kind of purchasing power parity information that then goes into the international comparisons of productivity, but it's also interesting to look at in its own right, because it tells you so much about international competition between these countries. So this is a very important step forward. US-Japan purchasing power parities, which are used to convert Japanese and US product into the same units. All of this is discussed in a book that I published last year. It's a book that I edited with Kyoji Fukao from Tokyo and Marcel Timmer from Groningen, the Netherlands. And this is a book about the world economy. So what we've done is to describe in this book the production accounts at the industry level for 40 countries, including the UK. And that's something then that has required 15 chapters to cover the whole world and 38 investigators. In other words, this has been a big international consortium working on this issue. We've also done international comparisons, like the one that I just described between Japan and the United States. And we then pose the question, is the world economy going to stagnate or is it going to continue to grow? Well, I'll leave you to have your own view about this. And I can tell you now, our view is that the world economy is going to continue to grow. But that's something that we'll elaborate in a little bit more detail. Well, we're not finished with production yet. So what I want to do is to show you how to use the production data. First of all, let's take the industry groups according to value added and define them among IT producing industries, IT using industries, those that are intensive in the use of IT, and non-IT industries. So the dark purple there at the top indicates the growth of the IT producing industries. And you can see that there are three time periods here, 47, 73, 95, ending in 73, 95, and 2012. This is in the paper that Rachel told you about, that I wrote with O and Samuels. And you'll notice that the relative share in terms of the growth of the US economy of information technology producing industries is steadily increasing. Before 1973, it's hardly noticeable at the top there. But then it more than doubled in terms of share after 1973. And then after 1995, doubled again. And so information technology has become much more important. But in nominal terms, in terms of the actual dollars of the current period, it never got above 2.5% of the US output. It's just that 2.5% translate into a very rapid growth rate if it turns out that you're looking at something whose price is declining very rapidly. Where did that growth come from? It came from the relative shrinkage of the non-IT industries, which are in the light red, the pink. And then the IT using sectors that are intensive in the use of IT technology, but not in the production, were essentially contributing about the same amount to economic growth. So the US had growth, as you can see, of a little over 3.5%, then it dropped to something under 3%, now it's down under 2.5%. But the composition has changed dramatically. We wouldn't know that without having industry-level data on production, which we didn't have in the US national accounts until 2013. Okay, well that's our story. If we look at it from the point of view of individual industries, there are 65 industries. Some of them are growing very rapidly, like the IT industries. Others are, if anything, diminishing, as you can see, and there's a tremendous amount of variability. But obviously the composition of the economy is changing very dramatically. We didn't have this kind of information in the US national accounts until the last 5 years. Now what I'd like to do is look at productivity, output per unit of input. And I've aggregated over the different sectors here to get the appropriate weights for aggregate productivity. So, The left-hand bar now is from 1947 to 2012. That covers the whole period. And productivity growth during this whole period was something around 0.6% per year. Fairly small portion of output. During the first part of the period, before 73, it was much larger than that, more like 1.2. Then it dropped after 1973 and then increased again. I have separated that into three parts. Namely, the yellow is IT, its contribution to productivity growth. Then there are the IT using industries, that's in the green, and the light yellow, which you can barely see, is the non-IT industry. So what's the conclusion? There was a lot of productivity growth in the non-IT industries before 73, but it disappeared after 73 and hasn't reappeared. But the source of productivity growth now at the industry level turns out to be very little due to the dark yellow, which is information technology. But after 73, that turned out to be predominant in the total, and that remained between 95 and 2012. So the importance of productivity growth can be attributed to the development of information technology. This is a tiny 2.5% of the economy, which is responsible for more than half of the growth in productivity. And so that's where the technological dynamism that preceded the Great Recession came from. Well, okay, I'm just about finished with the productivity story. The moral of this story, of course, is that we've accomplished a lot. This is a very recent set of developments where we could exhibit these data, and we can now produce data like this for 40 countries. That is a huge transformation. And so there are opportunities here in the UK to incorporate this kind of logic into the national accounts, and I'm very pleased to say that is on the agenda for the center, and so I'm very encouraged by the direction that this is going. This is a very important set of developments. Here is a story about productivity, if you want to look at it in terms of industries. And one thing that's quite remarkable is that not only are there very few industries where the productivity growth is taking place, that's all the IT producers, but there is a whole tail of industries that are slipping in terms of productivity. They're becoming less efficient, they're depleting their resources, they have more market imperfections, etc., and those are slipping backward. So we hope that growth in the future is going to be dominated by the rapidly growing industries at the top. Well, we're just about finished, but let me sum up by summing up the sources of growth in the U.S. economy, and now I'm going to aggregate over all these sectors and look at the aggregate figures. So I'm looking again from 47 to 2012. The growth of the economy was about 3% over this whole period, and productivity is in yellow, capital is in blue, labor is in red. Productivity is output per unit of input. Capital is divided between information technology and non-information technology. Information technology is the dark blue, non-information technology is the light blue. And capital and labor, rather, is divided between college labor, in other words, people with a university education or university degree, and non-college, the light pink. Well, you can see that there has been a sizable shift. Throughout the whole period, the growth of the U.S. economy, in terms of its sources, is dominated by capital. The next most important is labor, and the third most important is productivity. And what's quite remarkable is that if we look at the period as a whole, from 47 to 2012, the usual picture that we teach in graduate school, we still teach it this way, quite remarkably, because people teaching in a graduate school like me, but fortunately I don't have to do that anymore, is essentially using obsolete technology. If we use this current technology, consistent with the SNA 2008 view of the world, it turns out that productivity growth accounts for 20% of economic growth, capital and labor account for the rest. Kuznets and Solo teach just the reverse, 80% and 20%. 80% productivity, 20% growth of input. So this has changed our theory of productivity growth. And these changes in measurement
are very recent. I want to emphasize that again. Well, so much then for what has been accomplished. What we've seen is a lot of advance in the application of production, the disaggregation that I described of sectors, disaggregation by different types of capital, different types of labor, and with all that heterogeneity taken into account, the picture of economic growth changes dramatically. Productivity, of course, played a more important role until '73, almost disappeared, and then reappeared after '95. But of course, if we extrapolated this after 2012, we would find very, very little productivity growth. That's the well-known productivity slowdown. And of course, there has been a gradual slowdown. This was visible even before we looked at the data for the crisis. Well, all right, so let me close by talking about a different topic. I said that production is an accomplishment of the past. That's what we have succeeded in incorporating into our national accounts. That's true here in the UK, true in the United States, true for anybody who uses the SNA for 2008. That includes most countries in the world. And so we now have a much different picture of economic growth than the one that is in the textbooks. We have a different picture because of the uncovering, if you like, of the critical role of information technology and the relative unimportance of productivity growth. So what does that mean? That means that economic policy has to concentrate on investment in capital, both in the human form and in, let's call it, non-human capital. That is what is going to determine the outcome of this question, whether we're in stagnation or economic growth. I want to focus now, and I'm going to change totally from the emphasis on capital and emphasis on production to the unknown future of the standard of living and the measurement of welfare. Now, as I say, every conversation in this part of the discussion begins with the recognition that GDP is not a measure of welfare. That's right. So GDP is a measure of production, it's not a measure of welfare. And so what we need to do is to create a measure of welfare. Can we do that within the national accounts? That's the question. And so I'm going to propose a measure in the national accounts, and it's going to have the following elements. There's going to be a social welfare function, and that will come in two varieties, utilitarianism and egalitarianism. And then I'm going to divide for each one of those the increase in social welfare, the standard living, between efficiency and equity. In other words, ignoring distribution and taking distribution into account. I'm going to talk a little bit about alternative approaches, and then I'm going to say a few more words about beyond the GDP. So that's the remaining program, then we'll be finished and we'll open the floor for discussion. So again, we finished our discussion of production and productivity and economic growth. We found out that the textbook version of economic growth just turns out to be wrong from an empirical point of view. But now what I'd like to do is suppose that we went from GDP as not a measure of welfare and to try to answer the question, well, what is a measure of welfare? Well, it turns out that here we have an answer from the System of National Accounts for 2008 that is much less satisfactory. In 2008, the people who wrote the System of National Accounts document, which I showed you, said that the national account should not be given a welfare interpretation. In other words, you can't measure welfare. So this sounds familiar. Way back in '93, you couldn't measure capital and you couldn't measure input, so you couldn't measure productivity. Now, the national accounts are telling us you can't measure welfare. So we know that we should discount that. We shouldn't just take it literally. And we should ask ourselves, well, suppose we took a somewhat different point of view. Now you might say, well, how did these national accountants end up with a view that measuring welfare is impossible? Very simple. They took one of the best known theorems in theoretical economics called the Arrow impossibility theorem, and they said, Kenneth Arrow has proved that you can't measure welfare. That's just impossible. That's the famous impossibility theorem. All they're doing is simply reproducing what they learned so carefully back when they were PhD students. And if they're still teaching
they're probably teaching this arrow impossibility theorem. But here is the UK alternative to that, which is mainly due to two UK economists. First of all, there's my colleague Amartya Sen, a very, very distinguished economist indeed, occupying a unique place on both sides of the Atlantic and elsewhere. And also Kevin Roberts, who is a professor at Oxford. So what did they prove? Well, they looked carefully at the arrow impossibility theorem, and what they found was that there was a story about the assumptions in which, first of all, individual preferences are not comparable. They can't be compared. I can't compare my utility to yours. I can't compare it with anybody else's. That could be a matter of privacy, invading our consumer sovereign space, so to speak. Or it could be impossible, but Kenneth Arrow said that is a fundamental assumption that we need to make. And secondly, we need to make the assumption that utility for the individual is ordinal. It preserves orderings. It doesn't have any kind of cardinality like the GDP growth rate. Well, all right. So Amartya Sen began to examine this and said, well, maybe we ought to change these assumptions. And in particular, we should assume that standard of living involves measuring individual welfare in a way that is cardinal, not ordinal. How would you do that? Well, basically what you would do would be to figure out some way of representing preferences that is more specific than the one we use in our textbooks, but has cardinality associated with it. In other words, it's like the real numbers. It's not like some ordinal indifference map. Okay, that's point number one. Point number two, let's figure out a way to make individual preferences comparable. And so what people came up with as a result of this innovation was the idea that you could have cardinal, interpersonally comparable preferences. And there were two versions of that were proposed. One idea is that you can compare differences. So you and I can compare our utilities, not in terms of the absolute value of each one, but rather in terms of the difference. That's referred to as cardinal unit comparability because we use the same units for our utility. And if we take internationally or interpersonally comparable preferences and use cardinal unit comparability, we get a utilitarian measure of individual welfare. That was one of the very important insights on which the measures of inequality that the late Tony Atkinson used so effectively to develop theories of inequality in his path-making work on that subject. But then Kevin Roberts came along and said, we can strengthen this further by assuming that preferences are fully comparable. And that will lead to a more egalitarian theory of social welfare. Okay. Well, that takes care of then the assumptions about the arrow impossibility theorem, because it says instead of assuming that everything is ordinal and non-comparable, the way we usually do, Pareto optimality and all that, we're going to assume that they're cardinal and interpersonally comparable. Well, all right, how are you going to do that? You're going to actually fit a model in which you can derive such a measure, and that's what I've done in various places. So that's something that can be achieved. And then what we can do is take the corresponding social welfare functions, utilitarian in the Atkinson case, egalitarian in the case of Roberts, and we can define a measure of social welfare and divide that into two parts, efficiency and equity. And so that is going to be the basis for our measure of welfare. And so I'm going to propose that this be incorporated into the national accounts. And I've written an article that describes exactly how to do this and published that in 2014. So that's fairly recent information, but nonetheless, I think valuable. Let me just give you the interpretation, though, of how that works. It turns out that the measure of social welfare that you're going to use is to use a measure of individual welfare in which utilities are described in terms of consumption in real terms per household equivalent member. And the equivalence measure
is a way of measuring the size of the key consumer unit from which we're going to derive our measures of consumption. And that is based on what households actually allocate to adults, what they allocate to children, what they allocate to men, what they allocate to women, etc. And then we're going to combine all those into this measure of efficiency and equity. Well, before I tell you more, and I'm not going to tell you much more because we're running out of time, I want to show you what this looks like. First of all, it turns out that if I take real consumption per household equivalent member and take the logarithm, I can derive a growth rate for efficiency that is independent of the form of the utility function, whether it's egalitarian or utilitarian. And so, what we need to do is essentially to take that as the basis for the national accounts. That's something that appears in the national accounts. It's simply the real value of consumption for individuals, but per household equivalent member. And then let's measure the standard of living by applying a social welfare function, and we'll call the difference in logarithmic terms a measure of equity. Obviously, equity is going to be much more expensive in terms of welfare if we have an egalitarian than if we have a utilitarian system. Well, the conclusion is then that we can measure welfare, and we can put it into the national accounts, and that is a program for the future. Okay, well, we're finished, and so what I have here is essentially a summary of what I just said. What I said is that one of the great achievements of the past decade or decade and a half is to incorporate output, input, and productivity into the national accounts. That is a very important achievement that now covers 40 countries, of which about a dozen include this in the official national accounts, including the UK. The program for the next decade or so, maybe 5 years would be more accurate, would be to incorporate a measure of the standard of living that has this decomposition into efficiency and equity that I've described. Okay, let me give you just a brief glimpse of the future and then I'll close. It could be that we could go beyond the national accounts. I've talked about things we could do within the national accounts, but now we could go on to beyond the national accounts. What would we do? Well, what we could do would be to measure the concept of sustainability. And the World Bank has just come forward with a 2-volume study in which they measure a concept that they call genuine wealth. And that measure of genuine wealth turns out to be dominated by human capital. And so they take measures of human capital, empirical measures of human capital, which they now have for 141 countries, and they incorporate that into a measure for sustainability, which is beyond the national accounts. Why is it beyond the national accounts? Because the idea of human capital and investment in human capital is beyond the usual definition for GDP. So it's not within the national accounts, it's beyond the national accounts. That's where we can go for further progress. And of course there's a lot more work to do on international comparisons. Well, I think I'll stop there and take questions. Thank you very much.